You might fool others, but not us. That skin, that walk, that outfit screams hiding something. The cop shouted over the loudspeakers at JFK Airport, drowning out boarding calls. Christina Hayes, dressed sharp, no badge, no uniform, handcuffed like a criminal for being a stylish black woman. They demanded $1,000, 0 cents, to let her go, or she'd be detained. No proof, just prejudice. But what they didn't know, she's the director of the FBI. 6 minutes later, those same arrogant cops were on their knees, cuffed, pale, and shaking like whipped dogs. What state are you in? Ever seen cops extort and humiliate someone like this? The rolling suitcase glided smoothly over the marble floor of JFK Airport, its wheels making no sound. Christina Hayes walked straight through the security gate, her mustard yellow suit hugging her slender frame, and a pair of Tom Ford sunglasses covering half her face. At 52, she carried the kind of beauty that never needed to shout to be heard. She wasn't in a rush, nor did she seek attention, but her stride made people turn, not out of curiosity, but because of a presence that couldn't be imitated. A cold stare followed her from the Eastern Security Section. Lieutenant Ryan Vance had just glanced at the baggage screening monitor when he froze, a slight pause of someone who saw something that didn't quite fit. Beside him, Ben Carter, a young officer recently transferred from Florida, frowned and asked under his breath, "What is it?" Vance smirked, his voice low. "Someone who doesn't look like they belong." Carter raised an eyebrow, half joking, half wary. "You mean because she's black and dressed like a CEO?" Vance didn't respond immediately, but his eyes said more than any explanation could. "I mean, let's check to be sure." They didn't laugh, nor did they need a better excuse. The reflex of those familiar with random checks had kicked in. Christina had just retrieved her passport from the checkpoint desk when Vance stepped in, blocking her path. No courtesy, no badge introduction. "Ma'am, please step aside." She stopped, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Reason?" Vance's tone remained flat. "Additional baggage check. There's a concern." Ben Carter jumped in, his tone even more condescending. "A passenger reported suspicious luggage. There's also a statement suggesting you might be involved in smuggling illegal goods." The words were spoken slowly enough to emphasize each one, yet Carter's eyes betrayed a sliver of doubt, like he didn't fully buy the script they were trying to sell. Christina glanced at the stream of passengers still moving through the checkpoint, a few turning their heads as the tension grew. She showed no confusion and didn't ask further, just a nod. "I'll cooperate." "Where to?" Her voice carried no defiance, no submission, just the clarity of someone who knew very well arguing was useless. When people have already decided what they want to see in you, silence is the fastest way to let their error unfold. "You might fool others, but we can tell. The way you walk, dress, it's obvious you're hiding something." The officer's voice rang out across the JFK terminal, louder than the boarding announcements. Vance gestured. Christina turned to follow, heading into a side corridor toward an isolated screening area. Her footsteps echoed steadily, neither hurried nor hesitant, as if she were walking into a meeting, not a setup. Carter trailed behind, hand resting casually on his holstered gun. A gesture unnecessary, but clearly meant to intimidate. Vance glanced back occasionally as if hoping to catch a flicker of fear, but all they saw was a straight spine, a calm frame, and a suitcase rolling steadily behind a woman they thought they'd figured out, but in truth didn't understand at all. The screening room was tucked behind a side hallway, cold white walls, a metal table, no camera, no witnesses. Everything smelled faintly of antiseptic, but not enough to mask the stench of abused authority. Christina Hayes removed her coat, placed her belt and wallet on the table as requested. Her eyes never left the two officers in front of her, the gaze of someone long accustomed to being judged through the lens of bias. She had seen countless looks like theirs throughout her life, only now they came from men wearing law enforcement uniforms. Ryan Vance tore through her handbag with bare hands, no gloves, ignoring proper procedures. "Where are you flying in from?" He fired rapidly, his tone interrogative. "Purpose of visit to New York? Who paid for your ticket?" Christina replied crisply, every word slicing through their fabricated narrative. "I flew from Atlanta. Personal matters." I paid for the ticket myself. Vance shot Carter a glance, smirked. Carter crossed his arms, looking Christina up and down. What kind of personal matter requires dressing like a CEO? Christina didn't flinch, didn't react. There's no rule that says I have to dress poor to avoid being harassed. Let's be honest, you're suspicious because I'm black, aren't you? Her words were calm, unraised, but sharp enough to catch Carter off guard for a beat. Ben Carter scoffed, the laugh of a man uncertain but trying to assert control. Tough. You think you're special? Vance stopped playing subtle. He stepped forward, voice dropping but each word deliberate. If you've really got nothing to hide, then $1,000 won't matter. Pay us, we'll drop everything. If not, he pulled out a pair of cuffs from his belt, the metal glinting under the room's light. We're authorized to detain you for non-cooperation. In that moment, the room fell eerily silent. Christina stared at the cuffs as if seeing the ending they were choosing for themselves. Neither officer noticed the smart watch on her left wrist, its small light blinking 3 times in sequence, a coded distress signal sent directly to FBI headquarters, complete with GPS coordinates. In her mind, a protocol had already been triggered, automated, requiring no further words. Vance stepped in, gently twisting her arm behind her back, as if handling a suspect ready to resist. But Christina didn't resist, didn't scream, didn't beg. As the cuff clicked shut, she stood upright, shoulders unbowed, chin unlowered. Carter hesitated. Something felt off, but Vance was too far into his role. They thought they'd won. Christina exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed on the wall, as though behind that concrete surface lay an entire system whose inner workings she knew by heart. Her silence now wasn't fear, it was a wordless declaration. They had just destroyed themselves with the very cuffs they believed would break me. Christina Hayes sat upright, her hands cuffed to a fixed metal bar on the table. The windowless room was lit by a flickering fluorescent light, its harsh glow casting down on her white blouse, as if to expose flaws that didn't exist. Contrary to what they expected, she didn't bow her head, didn't shrink back, didn't ask why or when she could leave. She simply sat, observing. Her breathing was steady, eyes locked on the cold surface of the table. Ryan Vance paced behind her like a predator circling prey. He couldn't stay still, unable to bear the unnatural silence of a room designed to break people down. Ben Carter, younger and less experienced, appeared more at ease, holding a stack of documents pulled from Christina's bag, eyes skimming through the details, lips curling as if he'd found something amusing. Atlanta, one way, not carrying much cash, no special ID, looks like someone is hiding something, Carter said, summarizing a charge sheet he'd invented himself. Christina remained silent, no arguing, no explaining, no request for a lawyer. Not a word wasted. Vance grew impatient, slammed his hand on the table. You might fool others, but we see through it. The way you walk, the way you dress, it screams smuggling. His voice tightened with every word, as if her silence was an unforgivable act of defiance. Christina raised her eyes to him, not in defiance, not in fear, just looking, as if waiting for something that had already been predicted. If it cuffs just the beginning, Vance hissed. It all depends on how you want this to end. Across the table, Carter chuckled, but the laugh vanished when he met her eyes. There was nothing in them but calm, yet that calm froze the air. He turned away, pretending to read again, but the unease was already creeping onto his face. Christina looked down at her left wrist, where a smartwatch lay beneath her sleeve. A small motion, her thumb tapped the edge 3 times. The move took less than 3 seconds. Yet it was enough to activate the recording function and trigger an emergency signal to the FBI server. Every sound in the room, Vance's footsteps, Carter's disdainful voice, every word eroding the shell of justice, was now being encrypted, stored, and transmitted. Neither of the men noticed. To them, she was just another black woman who looked too polished and too suspicious, too quiet, too unwilling. But because they underestimated her, they missed the one sign that foretold what was coming. Christina didn't react because a reaction was what they wanted. They wanted her to scream, to lash out, to resist, to justify force, to claim she was but she denied them that chance. In their drunken arrogance of power, they didn't realize the one in handcuffs was the one running the show. Minutes passed, and the room thickened. The air no longer carried the chill of air conditioning, but the heat of unnamed tension. Ryan Vance, once aggressive, grew restless. He checked his watch, tapped the table, and glanced at Carter with visible impatience. Carter had already pulled out his phone, leaned back, scrolling through Facebook, as if this special inspection had overstayed its entertainment value. They didn't know her absolute calm was the trap they willingly stepped into, a trap that needed no bait, no words, only timing. Christina remained still, unblinking. Her face was a smooth mirror, reflecting none of the pressure they tried to impose. But inside, every move was calculated. In her 17 years in intelligence, she had faced Middle Eastern warlords, survived South American mafia ambushes, and negotiated with hostage-takers who had nothing left to lose. She knew silence wasn't weakness. It was a strategy to force the enemy to reveal itself. And this time, the enemy was too eager. The watch beneath her sleeve had completed its first task. The initial data packet, 22 minutes of insults, threats, and power games, was now encrypted and sent through a secure channel to the FBI server. In Washington, in an unnamed command room, a night shift agent received the alert. He didn't know the sender, but the label Priority Code, H1, made him shoot up from his seat, launch the decoder, and extract the audio. And in his earpiece, a man's voice played. The way you walk, the way you dress. It screams smuggling, a mocking laugh, a thinly veiled bribe, a calm woman's voice, not protesting. The truth was exposing itself. At JFK, Christina's breathing didn't change. She didn't need to know who was on duty or whether the signal had gone through. She understood. When you control the process, silence is the fastest way to make the system work. This wasn't just about her. She wasn't merely reclaiming justice for herself. She was embedding a data bomb inside the pride of men who thought law was theirs to bend. Carter looked up and noticed Vance staring at him, waiting for a reaction. "She's not going to say anything?" Vance growled. Carter shrugged, half joking. Maybe this is that calm before the storm thing. But he paused. Something in the air had shifted. Not an event, a feeling. As if they were no longer in control. As if they were being assessed. Christina gave them one last look, then turned her eyes toward the wall. The light on her watch blinked once, then went dark. It was done. The second data packet had been sent. The final one would be enough to end both their careers, without her needing to argue, scream, or beg. Because the strongest form of justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs evidence, and she had just collected enough. Basement level 4. FBI Rapid Response Coordination Center in Manhattan. A red warning light blinked on the signal panel, accompanied by a low-pitched alarm and a code line. H1, abuse of power. Immediate response required. No sender name. No incident description. Only a GPS coordinate from JFK Airport, tagged with a special authentication string used by only 3 individuals in the entire FBI system. And Christina Hayes was one of them. Agent John Riley, on night duty, took less than 3 seconds to grasp the situation. No reports, no approval requests. He simply said one word, go. The other 3 members of the response unit instantly left their seats, armed up with weapons, encryption gear, body cams, and data extraction drives. The semi-mobile tactical team left headquarters within 4 minutes, boarding a silver, unmarked armored vehicle and heading straight toward Queens. At JFK Airport, the rear access to the technical area was opened using a priority card. No prior notice was given to airport management. As Riley's team passed the internal security checkpoint, an airport security officer stopped them as protocol required. Riley didn't pause. He raised his badge, black card, top-tier H-level clearance, and gave a brief command, lock down the area. Open room 3C. No one dared ask why. In the airport security system, some questions, like why, only get you replaced. The door opened. Inside the isolation screening room, Ryan Vance leaned on the table, staring at Christina Hayes with a half-mocking, half-wary look. "I'll ask again. How long do you plan to keep up this silence act?" Carter shrugged and added, "Let's see if it's worth keeping this bitch for another hour." Just as the words left his mouth, the back door swung open a second time. No warning, no knock. 3 FBI agents entered simultaneously, tight formation, with equipment recording and arrest warrants in hand. Riley spoke, voice steady. "Ryan Vance, Ben Carter, you are under arrest for abuse of authority, violation of federal civil rights, and indications of extortion. Drop your weapons, step away from the detainee." The statement wasn't loud, but it landed with the weight of a sealed verdict. Vance turned around, confused. Carter froze like someone had suddenly unplugged him, and the woman seated in the middle of the room, still cuffed, didn't look at them, didn't speak, but in her eyes, the game had just turned. Ben Carter stood still, arms limp at his sides, eyes darting from one agent to the next, searching for a glimmer of hope that this was some kind of mistake. Ryan Vance spun around, mouth opening to protest, but before he could get a word out, a female agent had slammed his head onto the table in one swift move. In less than 5 seconds, his gun was stripped, his badge pulled from his chest, and a cuff locked tightly around his right wrist. A man used to giving orders now sat sealed by the very power he once misused. Christina Hayes remained seated. She didn't look up, didn't meet anyone's eyes. She slowly extended her cuffed hands forward, calmly, firmly, as if declaring in silence, "The reckoning has arrived." Agent John Riley stepped forward, unlocked her cuffs, and bent slightly, his eyes not just respectful but apologetic. "Director Hayes, I'm Riley. My sincerest apologies for the delay." The room shifted into something unreal. Just minutes ago, it had been a place where a woman was insulted, falsely accused, and threatened by 2 cops who believed they held control. Now, they were the ones in cuffs. And she, the woman they thought was just another black nobody, was in fact the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, someone with the authority to place an entire precinct under federal investigation, with a single decision. Carter tried to mutter something, but all that came out was a meaningless sound. Vance turned his face away, eyes shut tight, like bracing against a reality too brutal to accept. At that moment, an airport security officer stepped in. He froze at the door, stunned to see his colleagues restrained, black-suited agents collecting hard drives, detaching cameras, seizing access cards, and the woman, just uncuffed, standing tall with the presence of someone who had once overseen national covert operations. Christina said nothing. She gave a slight nod, and instantly one of Ryle's agents began reading out inventory, surveillance equipment, wall-mouth cameras, internal data loops, all sealed within 3 minutes. No search warrant needed. Her authority overrode all. No one on the team asked why. No one needed answers. But the security officer, his face still pale, managed to squeeze out a strained question. "Ma'am, why didn't you say you were the FBI director from the beginning?" The question wasn't asked out of curiosity, but from guilt already sinking in. Christina paused for a moment. She looked at him, voice low but resonant without force. "Because I wanted to see what you'd do when you thought I was nobody?" The body cam on Ben Carter's chest kept recording the entire time he insulted, threatened, and negotiated money with the handcuffed woman in front of him. Like every other day, he forgot that the camera wasn't just for show, wasn't just for filling out reports, and definitely wasn't there to skip recording things he didn't want captured. Every word he spoke, from looking a little too upscale to suggesting we settled this quietly for $1,000, was recorded in crisp audio and wide-angle video. There was no excuse. No blaming bad lighting, no claiming the footage was edited. No one had touched the footage but him. After subduing Vance and Carter, Agent Riley didn't waste time on protocol. He removed Carter's body cam, plugged it into a handheld encryption device. The screen blinked rapidly. Signal recognition, device ID verification, device H1 priority event code assigned. Within 2 minutes, the full footage was extracted into 3 segments. Segment 1, detainment and search. Segment 2, verbal abuse and bribery. Segment 3, the moment of handcuffing and Christina's reaction. Riley nodded once the SHA-512 hash appeared, confirmation that the data was untouched, unaltered, and admissible as evidence in federal court. Riley's teammate, Agent Morgan, received the data drive, plugged it into a high-speed transmitter, and used an internal emergency channel to send it directly to FBI Central Headquarters, the destination, the secure processing room on the 8th floor, accessible to only 5 people in the entire system. At the same time, an encrypted message popped up on a secondary screen. Authentication successful. Emergency event log. At the office of the Deputy Director of Internal Security, a status panel turned orange. Status: body cam evidence received. Status: critical. Less than 11 minutes after the footage was transmitted, an emergency meeting was called. Conference room C7 lit up at 3:27 p.m. On the main screen were the 3 extracted video clips. No one asked why a middle-aged black woman in handcuffs was flagged as an H1 priority. They didn't need to, because in the first segment alone, they saw a familiar face. And in the following clips, where she remained silent while 2 officers displayed ignorance, bias, and abuse of power, it became crystal clear this wasn't a routine airport incident. This was institutional embarrassment at the hands of the very people paid to protect it. The head of internal oversight said bluntly, "This is now a federal emergency case file. I recommend a full investigation, transferred to the Department of Justice within 24 hours. Everyone nodded. No emotion shown. But no one could deny the obvious. Those 2 officers had just unintentionally produced the perfect training video on how to obliterate your career using a camera you willingly wore. They didn't realize that with every minute they spent mocking someone they thought had no power, they were signing their own indictment. On the 6th floor of the FBI Central Data Analysis Center, the internal investigation room was dead silent. Each member of the misconduct analysis team watched Carter's body cam footage like it was a live reenactment of a crime. No blood, no gunshots, but enough arrogance, abuse, and toxicity to make the whole system flinch. Eliza No, lead technician, sat front and center with her headset on, eyes locked to the screen, reciting timestamps aloud with surgical precision. 0:01 and 44 seconds, the phrase, "doesn't look innocent." 0:03 and 9 seconds, emphasis on "not from around here." 0:07 and 51 seconds, bribery attempt, $1,000, 0 cents for freedom. Each time she spoke, another team member marked the corresponding timestamp. Nothing was skipped, nothing fast-forward, nothing trimmed, because every line spoken in that footage was now a legal weapon, admissible in front of a jury, Congress, or in law enforcement ethics training. No one interrupted Eliza, because that silence said more about the severity of the situation than words ever could. When someone in uniform can speak like that, casually, unafraid of being recorded, it's no longer an isolated lapse. It's a sign of a deep cultural deviation in a segment of the force's law enforcement mindset. In the main FBI office, Christina Hayes did not attend the meeting. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. What Vance and Carter had said, mocking, racially biased, casually proposing freedom in exchange for cash, now sat on analysts' desks like shards of a system thought untouchable. Christina was finishing the initial response report. Every word she wrote carried no anger, no personal vendetta, just cold, clean precision like a scalpel, effective, exact, and leaving no dead zones. She signed a proposal to open a multi-agency investigation, including 3 coordinated arms: the Department of Justice, DOJ, for criminal prosecution, the FBI for a broader investigation into systemic violations within the Port Authority Police, and the Federal Conduct and Policing Commission, FCPC. All actions were initiated the same afternoon, less than 8 hours after Christina had been handcuffed at JFK Airport. The morning silence they mistook for fear had now turned into high-level enforcement files, hard legal documents issued under the authority of the most powerful investigative office in the country. The insults once thrown around like casual banter were now sealed into federal evidence, and the men who once believed they could say anything would now hear their own voices in a closed courtroom in front of a cold jury and beneath the weight of careers crumbling under the force of every word they thought harmless. Because, as Eliza wrote in her very first summary, from this point on, every word spoken can and will be used to end the speaker's career. New York City Hall, 5th floor, internal meeting room of the Port Authority Police Department. The room was soundproofed, the curtains tightly drawn. On the whiteboard, a few words were hastily scribbled with a marker. Internal handling, sensitive, priority, reassure the public. Deputy Chief Nolan, a gray-haired man with a pragmatic gaze, opened the meeting with a sentence, "We can't let this hit the media in a way that smears the entire system." No one in the room denied that Ryan Vance and Ben Carter had crossed the line. The insults, the brutal use of handcuffs, the blatant bribe offer, none of it was defensible. Yet, rather than discussing legal consequences or ethics, the sole focus remained on 3 words: organizational image. A mid-ranking commander, dignified in appearance but constantly averting his gaze, spoke up with a suggestion. "I think we could send a private apology letter to Director Hayes. Along with it, an internal memo stating that the behavior of those 2 was isolated and does not represent the department as a whole." Another attendee, a communications advisor, quickly added, "Exactly. We should get ahead of the reaction. Let's proactively call to apologize to Director Hayes. After all, she's a senior colleague. If we show goodwill early, she might choose to resolve this internally instead of going public." Nods spread around the table like a reflex. A media cleanup seemed the familiar and safest route in this kind of image crisis. But all those calculations were built on a fatal assumption, that Christina Hayes would choose silence. They forgot she wasn't someone who sought leniency, and certainly not someone who would accept an internal resolution for such a serious violation of civil rights. They were negotiating with someone whose career had been forged not in closed-door reconciliations, but in public battles against cover-ups. While they discussed how to calm public opinion on the 7th floor of the U.S. Department of Justice headquarters, a report from the FBI Central had just been delivered to the Office of the Inspector General. At the top of the document was an urgent stamp and a bold, sharp headline, "Request for Public Handling." The report was not long, but it included a summary of events, extracted data from the body cam, a formal confirmation from the Rapid Response Team, and a single quote from Christina Hayes herself. "The public has a right to know what happened. I don't negotiate with systemic wrongdoing." Just one sentence, but enough to derail every discrete plan being drawn up in the City Hall meeting room. Because it wasn't an emotional statement. It was an official directive issued by the director of the FBI, demanding the initiation of a full federal investigation, bypassing intermediaries with no compromises and absolutely no off-the-record. When the meeting room secretary stepped in and handed Nolan a fax from the Department of Justice, the atmosphere immediately turned heavy. He skimmed a few lines, his face turning pale. "They want the full case file presented to the Internal Oversight Committee within 48 hours. A silence fell over the room like a weight. No one mentioned private resolution again. No one brought up a polite apology letter. Only the truth remained, flooding into the room without knocking, without invitation, without permission. And this time, the truth refused to stay behind closed doors. The next morning, before New York even entered the rush hour frenzy, the city's 3 largest newspapers simultaneously splashed the same headline across their front pages. FBI director illegally detained by airport police. Camera captures entire incident. Beneath it was a black and white photo, clipped from the body cam footage. Christina Hayes sitting upright, hands cuffed behind her back, her gaze neither panicked nor pleading, just eerily calm. Beside the image was a minute-by-minute timeline, from the initial stop, the baseless accusations, to the bribery bargain. The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Hashtag Christina Hayes, JFK arrest, justice or shame, shot to the top of trending lists in just 3 hours. A regional news station aired a special report, including a leaked 27-second clip. In it, Ryan Vance's voice could be heard with smug confidence. $1,000. Then get out of here. Christina's face was blurred, but the sound of metal clicking around her wrists was unmistakable. A female anchor commented live on air, "That's not just an insult to an individual. It's an insult to the very definition of justice." The Port Authority Police Department descended into chaos. Calls poured into the Public Affairs Office. Emails from journalists, lawmakers, oversight groups, even from the Congressional Judiciary Committee. Some reporters camped outside headquarters, demanding a public press conference. The leadership called an emergency meeting by noon. Legal advisors urged immediate coordination with federal attorneys to assess legal damage and launch an urgent PR strategy. In the meeting, a senior official exclaimed, his voice a blend of panic and anger. It was supposed to be just a local misconduct case. How did it become a national crisis? No one dared answer, because everyone knew it wasn't the fact that the person in cuffs was the FBI director that made this serious. It was that the person in cuffs chose not to stay silent. While the entire system scrambled to manage the fallout, Christina Hayes did not appear on camera, did not hold a press conference, and did not give interviews. She knew well, silence, when used at the right time, is the loudest voice. Instead of lengthy statements, she issued a brief official press release from the office of the FBI director. It was only 3 paragraphs, under 150 words, but enough to shut down every attempt at smoothing things over. "I don't need an apology. I need transparency. I don't need to be appeased. I need the system to understand. No one has the right to insult justice and walk away in the dark." The statement was reprinted in full on the front page of the Washington Post, read verbatim on national television during prime time, and shared by thousands online with the caption, "One statement, no one in the system could carelessly use the phrase minor incident anymore." Because once the head of the FBI has declared war on cover-ups, every effort to hide, obscure, or sidestep becomes nothing more than dragging oneself into the spotlight. And once the truth has entered the light, it never returns to the dark. 3 days after the incident at JFK Airport, at 7:42 a.m., in a closed-door session at the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York, Judge Barbara Leeds signed the arrest warrants for 2 suspects, Ryan Vance and Ben Carter. The 19-page document was precise and cold, like a verdict already passed. 2 formal charges were specified: violation of civil rights under Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code, an offense involving abuse of governmental authority to infringe on a citizen's rights, and conspiracy to commit extortion under the Hobbs Act, typically applied in cases where officials use threats, coercion, or exploitation of power for personal gain. The maximum sentence for each charge, 20 years in prison. At the FBI's internal holding facility in Brooklyn, Agent John Riley was assigned to carry out the arrest. There was no midnight raid, no shouting or door kicking. Everything proceeded in order, but it was that very order that made the atmosphere heavy. Riley carried 2 folders as he entered the holding cell. 2, where Ryan Vance sat with his legs stretched out as if still assuming the posture of someone used to giving orders. He looked up at Riley and gave a faint nod. "So, you're finally going to tell me what this is about?" Riley said nothing. He placed the folder on the table, opened to the first page, and read aloud, clearly and calmly. "Ryan Vance, by order of the federal court, you are placed under arrest for the following charges. 1. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law. 2. Conspiracy to commit extortion under the Hobbs Act." Vance jumped to his feet, the chair tipping backward, his hand slamming the table. "I never asked for money. That was Carter. I was just standing there. I was his superior. I let him handle it." Riley remained silent. He flipped to page 3 and pulled out an A5-size transcript excerpt, highlighted with timestamp 007 and 51 seconds. $1,000. Then get the hell out. Ryan Vance's voice. Clear, unmistakable. Riley said nothing else. He simply left the sheet on the table, as if it needed no further argument. As the handcuffs clicked shut a second time, Vance was still resisting. He screamed as he was escorted out of the room. "I won't plead guilty. I know the law. This is a setup. She framed me." But but no one contradicted him. There was no need. He had been the one wearing the body cam that captured every word he said, and the law he had always invoked was no longer on his side. The hallway leading to the transport vehicle was barely 20 meters long, but for Ryan Vance, it was the longest walk of his life, because it was no longer a corridor between offices, but a passage into a world where his power had been stripped. No more radio on his belt, no more badge on his chest. No one would call him Lieutenant Vance again. From this moment on, he was nothing but a defendant facing the very system he once believed he belonged to. And in that world, the man who knew the law, as he claimed, would now have to relearn it from the standpoint of someone on trial. In stark contrast to Vance's rage, Ben Carter received his arrest notice with near total silence. No yelling, no protest, no attempt to defend himself. He simply sank to the edge of his seat, hands clenched tightly as if trying to stop his body from trembling. As the agent read the final clause of the arrest warrant in a steady, cold voice, Carter pressed his lips together, eyes fixed on the tiled floor. And then, after several still seconds, he slowly nodded, not to confess, but enough to show that his initial resistance had begun to crumble. Ben Carter was barely in his 30s, having recently transferred from a small town in Florida to New York just over 10 months ago. His internal file showed no clear black marks, noted as hot-headed, prone to making independent decisions, but never officially reprimanded. On paper, Carter was the textbook example of a young, still developing officer, and that was the problem. People like him, not old enough to stay silent, not stupid enough to die with a mistake, were the weakest links in a chain of collective wrongdoing. In Interrogation Room 3, fully equipped with recording equipment, Carter sat across from a court-appointed attorney, an older man with graying hair and a soft but firm voice. For the first 15 minutes, Carter said nothing. His hands were clenched, his posture slumped, his gaze unfocused. The attorney reviewed the charges, then placed his hand on the table and leaned forward patiently. "I can't advise you to plead guilty, but I must tell you this. If you cooperate now, before the indictment is finalized, the opportunity for a reduced sentence is very real." Carter didn't respond immediately, but his eyes began to change, no longer stiff or closed off. Instead, there was a rising panic, like someone finally realizing that the silence he clung to no longer protected anyone, not even himself. He muttered, almost to himself, "If I talk, if I tell everything, what good would it do?" The question didn't carry defiance. It felt like a quiet search for the value of truth, when everything seemed beyond control. The lawyer didn't reply at once. He looked directly into Carter's eyes, his voice dropping low. "You didn't give the orders, but if you stay silent, you will be tried as a co-conspirator." A simple sentence, delivered at the right moment. Carter closed his eyes, a long, slow, heavy breath. Moments like these don't appear in legal records or crime reports, but they mark the turning point in a man's life, when he stands between two cliffs: preserve a shred of honor, or unburden himself through late cooperation. Vance told me not to worry, that no one believes black people anyway, that I just had to stand there and he'd handle the rest, Carter said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't quite a confession, but neither was it a denial. The lawyer gave a slight nod, opened a blank notebook, and placed his pen down. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything, nothing more, nothing less." Cracks were beginning to form, and in a system used to silencing insiders, one weak link, choosing to break the pact of complicity, could open the floodgates for a wider investigation. In the courtroom, the victor isn't always the one who speaks the truth, but the one who knows when to break the silence before it buries them. Ben Carter hadn't yet chosen a side, but once someone begins to waver, the rest is only a matter of time. And the system Ryan Vance thought could stand firm on violence and lies was now shaking from within, because of the very colleague he once deemed the best, because he was the most obedient. 3 days after being detained at the Brooklyn Federal Security Facility, Ben Carter requested to meet with a federal prosecutor. No one coerced him. No threats were made. It wasn't after a sleepless night. It was simply that morning, as Carter sat silently by the barred window, Listening to the wake-up announcement over the loudspeaker, he turned to his lawyer and said in a flat voice, "I'll cooperate, but I want a written deal." Carter's lawyer looked up from his stack of documents, visibly surprised. In the previous 2 meetings, his client had only given fragmented responses. "I don't remember. I was following orders. I didn't think it would go that far." No denials, but no confessions either. A prolonged state of neutrality until those 5 words, "I want a written deal." It wasn't just a legal statement. It was a clear sign Ben Carter had stepped out from under the shadow of complicity. The interrogation was promptly arranged in a secure interview room with a federal prosecutor, 2 FBI agents, and Carter's defense attorney present. Carter sat in the middle, still wearing his gray prison uniform, hair slightly tousled, face wary but eyes sharp. He began with what everyone already knew, that Vance was the one who said, $1,000. Vance gave the order to cuff a woman whose identity hadn't even been confirmed, that the verbal abuse caught on video was real, and that was only the surface. "You guys know about the quota, right?" Carter asked, his tone no longer confrontational but slightly cold. "We were given unofficial instructions. Each month we had to hit a target of passenger checks with suspicious indicators." "What indicators?" "Dark skin, designer suits, high-end luggage, overly confident behavior." He paused for a moment, then added, "I used to think it was just talk, but it kept being repeated. Then it became a soft directive. Then it became part of how our unit's performance was measured." One FBI agent took notes with his head down. The federal prosecutor stayed silent, not interrupting. Carter continued, "Lieutenant Simmons, my team leader, once said in front of the whole squad, the more aggressive you are, the faster you'll get promoted. Don't let them think the airport is their safe zone." Everyone knew who he meant by them. Carter's lawyer gave a slight nod, signaling to the investigators that this wasn't fabrication. At that point, Carter pulled out a USB stick containing encrypted audio files, with an explanation. "I recorded it to protect myself. Never thought I'd use it, but now I'm not dying with them." The 38-minute recording captured Simmons and Vance discussing pressure tactics that technically don't violate policy, how to avoid complaints, how to fabricate justifications for detaining suspicious individuals. Ben Carter was no hero. He didn't deny his own wrongdoing, but clearly his change of stance wasn't driven by conscience. It was the realization that the system he thought would protect him was collapsing, and if he didn't detach in time, it would bury him too. When he signed the written testimony, no one in the room called it routine cooperation. They called it the opening blow against a rotten system. As soon as Ben Carter signed the cooperation agreement, the USB containing the recordings was transferred to the FBI's Emergency Data Analysis Division. Within 8 hours, all audio files were decrypted, analyzed, and cross-referenced with internal personnel records. Investigators quickly confirmed that at least 4 of the quips mentioned specific officers. No longer rumors or insinuations, but clear voices, explicit words, and evidence of a system that had grown comfortable issuing orders without leaving a paper trail. The first name confirmed was Lieutenant Harold Dykes, responsible for assigning random screening schedules at Crest Hill Airport. In the audio, he spoke about maintaining a stable ratio of screenings for black passengers weekly to avoid red flags on the violation analytics dashboard. A veiled way of saying racial profiling wasn't a violation as long as it was spread evenly across the data. The second name was East Terminal Special Unit Commander Frank Devers, who had directly proposed the expanded screening without cause model in an internal meeting 3 months earlier. On the recording, his voice was firm and clear. "Always go deep on the ones with Beats headphones and Rimowa suitcases. Those types are either hip-hop punks with dirty money or wannabe business types. Hit 'em hard and let me deal with it later." Every word was a blade slicing through the official facade that senior officers had long used to dodge accountability. The other 2 were from the Internal Affairs Office, the ones responsible for receiving public complaints, those who were supposed to stop violations before they escalated. But in the final recording, Carter named them and added, "I once reported Ryan wrongly arresting an Arab woman with diplomatic credentials, but they told me, 'You sure you want to accuse a superior? Watch out or you'll end up reassigned to a border post. No formal threat, no explicit coercion, just the way a system protects itself, through unspoken understanding and fear. But the biggest twist was in the third recording. A conversation between Carter and Lieutenant Simmons, Ryan Vance's direct superior. In it, Simmons said, "Just do it. No need to ask questions. The faster we handle these, the better. If anything happens, I'll handle it." It wasn't an overtly illegal order, but it chilled the federal prosecutor because it exposed a culture of ambiguous directives designed to avoid responsibility. A culture everyone understood, but no one dared to put in writing. The intel was compiled into a classified briefing, delivered directly to FBI Director Christina Hayes the following morning. She read it once, didn't reach for her phone, didn't call a meeting. She simply circled one line in blue ink in the report's final summary. Contamination level higher than expected. Recommend expanding the scope to the multi-agency investigation. No further instruction was needed. That same afternoon, an emergency directive was issued. All officers named in the recordings were to be immediately suspended, pending investigation. 8 people, 8 uniforms, 8 cracks in what was once thought to be solid concrete. Christina wasn't surprised. She had investigated far more complex mafia networks. But what she could not accept was the indifference of those who were supposed to uphold integrity. Those who once thought she was just a high-ranking victim of a wrongful arrest now understood. She didn't just survive the incident. She had quietly begun dismantling the walls of a system rotted from the core. The second preliminary hearing of Ryan Vance was held in a high-security conference room on the 4th floor of the FBI New York headquarters. There were no news cameras, no press, no privately chosen attorneys. Only federal investigators, representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and an automated encrypted recording system. After nearly a week of denying all charges, blaming his subordinates, and staying silent in the face of mounting evidence, Ryan Vance abruptly changed course. He requested to be reinterrogated to clarify what the public hasn't heard. His opening statement sucked the air out of the room. "We were instructed to screen people of color who looked out of place." Vance didn't raise his voice, didn't sound angry. He spoke evenly, like reading from a training manual. He avoided using the word race explicitly, but his descriptions were clear. He spoke of weekly morning briefings, where phrases like prioritize screening individuals whose financial appearance doesn't match their attire, or watch those who appear tense despite no clear violation were repeated like mandatory protocol. There were no official documents, no recorded orders, but everyone understood the targets were people of color, especially when they appeared in spaces considered reserved for another class. "No one said it outright," Vance said, eyes unblinking, "but everyone understood. It was an unspoken system. If you followed it, you kept your position. If you pushed back, you got your shifts changed, pulled from patrols, or labeled inflexible. I didn't start anything. I just did what everyone else was doing." He wasn't confessing, he was redefining guilt. From an individual act, he elevated it to an institutional issue. His closing line, "I just wasn't smart enough to pick the right person to make an example of," was a knife twist, flipping the roles of victim and perpetrator. To Vance, his mistake wasn't in the act, it was in the choice of target. It shouldn't have been the director of the FBI. The investigators sat still. No one objected, no one questioned, only silent note-taking. Because if his statements could be corroborated, not by him alone, then the entire recruitment, training, and deployment process of law enforcement at critical points like airports would need to be reevaluated from the ground up. Vance showed no remorse. He wasn't trying to play the victim, he was doing something else, dragging the whole system into the same shadow where he no longer stood alone, but as one of many components who had learned to normalize wrongdoing through repetition. The transcript of his statement was classified Top Secret Tier 1 and immediately transferred to the Internal Behavioral Analysis Unit. A sealed copy was also sent to the office of Director Christina Hayes, with one note attached. This testimony calls the current scope of investigation into question, recommend expanding the target list. One sentence had torn the boundary between personal misconduct and organizational policy, and from that moment on, no one in the investigative team could claim that the JFK incident was an isolated case. The transcript, marked Classified, Urgency Level 1, was delivered directly to Director Christina Hayes' office within an hour of the interrogation. It wasn't sent through the system. It was hand-delivered by a supervising agent from the Interagency Task Force, who simply placed it on her desk and said quietly, "Special report." Not through the secretary. Christina nodded, asking nothing. She shut the door behind him. Alone, each line of the testimony was presented clearly, uncut. The first sentence, "We were instructed to screen people of color who looked out of place," pierced like a cold blade into the deepest layer of her belief system. Christina read slowly, word by word, paragraph by paragraph. Her eyes didn't twitch, her hands didn't shake, but her breathing changed. For the first time since she'd been handcuffed at JFK, she didn't move immediately to the next page. She looked up, stared into the reflective glass window, not because she didn't understand, but because she didn't want to believe. In her 30 years in the service, she had seen misconduct. She had arrested embezzling officers, confronted rogue members of special task forces trying to bury evidence. But she always believed those were the impurities in a system that still had an ethical core. She had thought, if I stay principled enough, firm enough, justice will ultimately prevail. But now, the words from Vance, someone she had once seen as merely arrogant and poorly trained, revealed a deeper truth. Perhaps she hadn't been targeted for who she was, but for being the kind of person the system was programmed to distrust. Christina didn't cry. She didn't slam her fists on the table. She didn't shout like in those dramatic crime dramas. She just froze. In that wide office, once filled with national crime maps and the coordination of global operations, now there was only a desk and a file that said what the entire system had tried not to say, that perhaps justice hadn't been abused, but misprogrammed from the beginning. She picked up the landline, dialed an internal number. Her voice was not loud, but firm. "I need a special meeting. Invite DOJ representatives, the Executive Oversight Committee, the Interagency Task Force, and the Internal Policy Analysis Team. Time. Tonight." No explanation needed. No one dared to decline. She set the phone down, grabbed a pen, and wrote one line on the whiteboard calendar behind her. Behind her, agenda, the shadow policy, reality or excuse. One question, not for debate, but to steer a conversation from which no one would be allowed to remain silent. Whether Vance's testimony was an attempt to lessen his sentence, shift blame, or manipulate public perception no longer mattered, because that one statement, intentional or not, had forced the justice machine to look itself in the mirror. Every person in uniform, every former leader of the system, now had to ask themselves, are we enforcing the law or reenacting bias under its name? Christina closed the file, placed it in the top drawer, stood up. Without a moment's hesitation, she no longer moved like someone wounded, but like someone who had just realized she had no choice left but to dismantle the very wall she once believed in. 3 days after an emergency meeting with the Department of Justice and the Interagency Investigation Team, Christina Hayes ordered the creation of a dedicated data security task force to review all internal FBI training documents. The focus, programs related to identifying abnormal behavior at public security checkpoints. The task sounded simple. Audit, cross-erect, and verified documents based on release dates and approving authorities. But within just 8 hours, the technical team uncovered something that made the entire investigative unit sit up straight: deliberate data tampering and deletion, carried out after Ryan Vance's testimony had been officially recorded. Specifically, over a dozen files related to behavioral analysis training from 2019-2022 were found missing their creation dates, with metadata histories wiped, or worse, replaced with meaningless summaries bearing vague titles like Frontline Environment Overview or Interpreting Ambiguous Situations. The chilling coincidence? The missing sections corresponded exactly to those describing individuals requiring additional scrutiny, with phrases like exhibiting behavior inconsistent with present context, appearing in backup versions but completely erased from the current files. A system log brought even more clarity. Someone had logged in with C3 clearance, an access level granted only to regional training leadership, and performed deletions, edits, and overwrites at 3:12 IE Emming, less than 6 hours after Vance's testimony was encrypted and uploaded to the investigative monitoring system. The person didn't use an external IP address. They operated directly from the internal server cluster at the FBI Eastern Regional Office in New York. When the tech team traced a backup server configured to auto-save original versions every 14 days, they recovered an unaltered version. Among the contents was a single slide, untitled, unnumbered, but enough to reveal the danger, identifying potential targets, no legal predicate required, based solely on frontline perception of abnormal behavioral traits. The slide was white-gray, written in technical language with no overtly discriminatory wording, but anyone reading it could clearly understand what it was implying. In the bottom right corner, a faint logo reading, Special Behavioral Division, Eastern FBI. For the first time in the investigation, the misconduct was no longer tied to frontline officers or the individuals directly involved, but rooted inside the FBI's own training infrastructure. The very people entrusted with educating law enforcement had embedded bias, not overtly but subtly enough to evade accountability, and normalized enough to pass unquestioned. When the report reached Christina, she asked just one question. Is there a sign-off on this material? The tech team replied, no electronic signature found, but the edit history shows access from a high-level credential, almost certainly from the Regional Training Division. Christina understood immediately. Someone wasn't just cleaning up a mistake, they were blocking a leak, not to protect Vance, but to protect something bigger, an operational principle that was never meant to be written down, but had long been embedded in how the system functioned. When the technical report was sent to the director's office, Christina Hayes stood silently in front of the large display, watching data scroll like fracture lines, slowly appearing in a structure she had once trusted completely. The timeline was explicit, 3:12 AIEM, access from the New York cluster, C3 level credentials, deletion of 12 original files. On the exact day Vance's statement was uploaded to the priority analysis system. Not a minute earlier, not a byte extra, not one missing. Junior agent nearby, voice trembling but trying to sound diplomatic, offered, "Ma'am, it could be a system error, or just an unfortunate timing overlap." Christina turned to him, not cold, but with an expression that sliced through assumption. She raised her hand, cutting him off. No one gets lucky enough to know exactly what to delete, exactly when, just after a suspect's statement is logged. Her voice was low and final. It wasn't a denial, it was confirmation of what no one in the room had dared to say out loud. We have someone on the inside trying to shield a policy they can't admit exists. Without hesitation, Christina invoked a special authority, internal traceback protocol, the highest level of investigative clearance permitted only when there's evidence of structural system manipulation. Her order authorized a full lockdown of all federal access logs for the past 30 days, across all linked server clusters. Trace teams were activated across 3 divisions: digital forensics, security monitoring, and access analytics. Exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes later, the result was on her desk. The person responsible for the data deletion, Richard Keene, Director of Training Quality Control, FBI Eastern Division. Keene's record was spotless. Outwardly, he was a seasoned professional. 24 years in the agency, praised for his procedural rigor. That very reputation led people to assume he had no reason to hide anything. And that was the danger, when the gatekeeper is also the one who knows exactly what to bury so the structure doesn't collapse. Keene was suspended immediately. His personal computer, mobile devices, and paper records were seized and sealed under top-level security protocol. Christina felt no triumph, She didn't look at him as a traitor, but as someone who had just confirmed for her that the foundation she had stood on for 30 years was now cracking from the inside, inch by inch. At the emergency session of the Executive Enforcement Council, Christina stood. No notes, no reports in hand. She simply looked around and said, "We're not just hunting those who act. We have to confront those who've gotten used to hiding their hands, then rewriting the record from the shadows to favor their version of history." No one interrupted, because there was nothing left to justify, not when the evidence showed that sometimes the one burning the archives isn't outside the gate, but wearing a staff badge and walking past every layer of security with credentials issued by the system itself. Christina knew this battle had entered a new phase, no longer about exposing individual misconduct, but about confronting a culture of concealment. And the hardest enemy to face wasn't the one breaking the law, but the one who had once stood beside you and is now willing to bend truth to preserve the illusion that the system is just fine. The investigation into the JFK Airport incident was spiraling beyond the control of those who once dismissed it as an isolated behavioral incident. From the audio recordings provided by Ben Carter, the FBI traced connections that expanded the scope from a single patrol unit to an entrenched network spanning multiple airports, regional police departments, and internal oversight units. Every day, Christina Hayes received reports from 3 directions: from the Department of Justice, updates on pending prosecution files; from the Federal Task Force, compiled lists of personnel to be summoned; and from the Office of the Federal Police Oversight Committee, cataloging procedural violations and internal monitoring. Each report didn't just add a new name, it revealed another layer of dust covering a system once considered solid. Beneath its disciplined facade, mechanisms of soft resistance to oversight were being exposed. Quickly closed case files, inspections with no documented minutes, behavioral violations filed away like clerical mishaps. All together, they formed a network that protected misconduct through silence and procedure. But that very expansion placed Christina in an unwanted standoff. Local police departments, once longtime collaborators with the FBI, began refusing to cooperate. Some went so far as to publicly denounce her. "The FBI is overstepping its bounds," said the police chief of Missouri on live television. "You can't indict an entire force over a single event." A state official called it a political purge, implying Christina was leveraging investigative power to assert personal dominance. Within law enforcement circles, a wave of resentment spread. On conservative forums, she was labeled the Iron Coon, with memes bearing captions like, "Destroying law to save justice." Christina offered no response. She did not appear before the public, gave no press interviews, issued no personal rebuttals. Instead, she sent out a brief, cold, urgent internal directive to all FBI personnel involved in the task force. Any obstruction of this investigation, whether from partner agencies or local law enforcement, will be treated as a federal violation. No gray zones, no exceptions. It was not a long statement, but it made her uncompromising stance unmistakable. That firmness caused immediate ripples. Some senior FBI officials grew concerned the matter was spiraling out of media control. A few federal lawmakers began asking, "Is Christina Hayes turning the FBI into a rival of the entire national police system?" Mainstream media split into 2 camps. One called her the last to uphold justice's ideals. The other branded her a political fuse with no offset. But Christina knew better than anyone. If the JFK case was buried like hundreds of others before, the FBI would no longer deserve to call itself a guardian of federal justice. This wasn't just a battle against rogue officers. It was a fight to defend a promise. Justice does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the truth. And to protect that truth, she had to be ready to confront an entire system accustomed to preserving quiet through compromise. As pressure from local police departments mounted, Christina Hayes began to sense another current. Quieter, but no less dangerous: internal resistance within the FBI itself. It started with subtle signs. A critical investigation strategy meeting was postponed due to sudden schedule conflicts from two division heads in charge of data analytics. A legal report from internal counsel was submitted 3 days late, with no apology, no explanation. Some inter-ocean coordination calls were redirected to voicemail. No one openly objected. No one voiced outright criticism, but it was the prolonged silence, the well-timed absences of those who should have stood present, that signaled a crack forming at the core. Christina knew this wasn't professional incompetence. It was a conscious choice to remain silent, to self-protect. No one wanted to clash with the national law enforcement network. Not everyone in the FBI believed that striking hard at allies was the right path, and the first to show hesitation was none other than the person closest to her, Deputy Director Richard Moore. In an emergency leadership meeting, when Christina proposed expanding the investigation to include other federal checkpoints with unresolved civil complaints, Moore was the first to push back. He didn't raise his voice, but his words were clear. "I'm concerned that the current pace of investigation is exceeding its original scope. We risk creating a climate of fear within our own ranks. Perhaps it's time to reassess the necessity of scaling this up." Christina didn't interrupt, but she looked him straight in the eyes. It wasn't a look of tension or anger, but a silent acknowledgement. The trust they once shared had shifted. Moore had been the first to support her appointment as director. Now he was the first to question where the line between enough and too much should be drawn. The meeting ended early. On her way back to her office, Christina scanned through emails. One proposal stood out: temporary closure of investigation files, lacking sufficient grounds for prosecution. It came from a lower-ranking official, but the CC line included Richard Moore, an unofficial directive, but enough to signal that the FBI's internal lines were being drawn. That evening, she sat alone in her office. Outside, the season's first cold rain fell. Under the soft yellow glow of her desk lamp, she stared at the FBI badge etched on her ID and whispered without sound, "If they fear disruption, they forget that justice was never born from comfort." She knew that from this point forward, every step forward would have to push not only against outside systems but through the very people who once stood beside her and now no longer dared to continue. Federal Court of Brooklyn, Courtroom 2. A Monday morning with nothing unusual on the docket, except for one name among the witnesses: Christina Hayes, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. From early morning, reporters lined up outside. National media set up live streams. Inside, more than 60 attendees waited. Representatives from human rights groups, bipartisan lawmakers, renowned attorneys, families of police abuse victims, and even some of Hayes's harshest critics. The air was thick, like behind soundproof glass. Everyone understood. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a confrontation between truth and the system. When Christina Hayes walked in, there was no special escort, no display of power, just a woman in a black suit, white shirt, no heavy makeup, and eyes that weren't seeking sympathy. She carried a thin file, not for a speech, but to validate each word with evidence. The clerk read her name. No one asked who she was. No one needed a reminder that this was the woman who had become a national focal point, not because of her title, but because of her calm in the face of injustice, never once raising her voice. The federal prosecutor asked her to confirm her identity and role. Christina Hayes, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Confirmed by the Senate on February 3 of last year, she answered evenly. Can you recount the events of March 18 at JFK Airport? The prosecutor continued. Christina nodded, not looking at him, but straight at the jury. On the morning of March 18, I arrived at JFK for an internal coordination mission. I wore no uniform, no visible badge, and did not reveal my identity. After clearing the checkpoint, I was stopped by officers Ryan Vance and Ben Carter on suspicion of suspicious behavior. They presented no warrant, they explained no process, they suggested I could settle it quickly with a cash payment of $1,000. When I declined, they handcuffed me without reading my Miranda rights, without legal counsel. I did not resist. I let them finish the process because I wanted to see with my own eyes how the system treats someone it perceives as powerless, nameless, and voiceless. I wanted to see if they would stop. Had they assumed I was just a black woman who dressed unusually? The courtroom was silent. No chair moved, no pen tapped. Only her voice, calm, unwavering, made the room hold its breath. The prosecutor asked, "Didn't you think revealing your identity could have prevented the incident?" She paused, then answered plainly, "My title isn't meant to save me from mistreatment. It should scare them, even when they don't know who I am." One juror lowered their gaze. A translator wiped her eyes. There was no pain in Christina's words, but the composure struck deep. It wasn't a victim's testimony. It was the voice of someone who once held supreme authority, yet chose to endure humiliation to prove a truth. No one interrupted. Everyone understood this moment wasn't just about two officers. It was a national test of faith in justice. As Hayes concluded, the prosecutor asked to play body cam footage recorded by Officer Ben Carter. 6 minutes and 12 seconds, sealed under file H1, unedited, unblurred, unmuted, as federal evidence mandate. The room dimmed. The footage began with Carter approaching Christina. Vance's voice was clear. "Too fancy of a purse. That walk doesn't look ordinary, does it? Then, $1,000, then get out of here, or I'll detain you for non-cooperation." A sharp click, metal cuffs. A calm female voice. "What's the reason for the arrest?" No answer. Carter's breath. Vance's smirk. "Someone like this would be wasted without cuffs." The video paused. Christina sat, cuffed, composed, not looking at them, just watching, not angry, not hurt, just still, with the weight of truth. The room froze. No applause, no murmurs. Those who once claimed Christina exaggerated now lowered their eyes in silence. A few journalists typed, then stopped. One congresswoman, previously opposed to police investigation expansion, wiped tears, not out of sympathy, but shame. Less than an hour after the hearing, the video leaked. Over 11 million views in 6 hours. Hashtag "She Did Not Flinch" trended. People wrote, "If even the FBI director can be treated like this, how many others have suffered in silence?" She sat without shouting, but made the entire country listen. Outside, hundreds held signs. Justice is not a privilege. Some who once ignored the issue now asked questions. Some who once backed law and order reconsidered. Where safety ends and abuse begins. Christina gave no statement. She exited through the side door. No wave, no comment. But her image, descending the courthouse steps under the fading winter sun, was broadcast nationwide. A political commentator said, "This isn't just her story anymore. It's the first time the system was forced to face a mirror and couldn't look away." Tuesday night, Manhattan Federal Detention Center. Pale yellow hallway lights cast shadows across rows of iron-barred doors, each one like a drawer holding a life that hadn't been fully unpacked. Ryan Vance walked past them with his hands loosely cuffed in front. No one pushed him, no one needed to. But his steps, now, no longer carried the cold confidence of an officer used to giving orders. The morning hearing replayed in his mind like an echo in an empty chamber. Christina Hayes's face, calm, without bitterness, stood before the court and spoke only the truth. No shouting, no condemnation, no appeal to pain. And yet it was that composure, that unshifting tone, that made Vance feel like the courtroom had no air left to breathe. The cell door clanked shut behind him, a sound he knew well, but this time it rang out like a verdict without a judge. Vance didn't lie down on the cot like usual. He sat on the cold bench, back against the wall, head bowed to his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that everything he thought was solid had just been hollowed out. No one outside could hear him, but the ceiling camera, recording every moment in that cell, caught something even he didn't expect to show. Ryan Vance lowered his head, shoulders quivering slightly, and cried. Not the cry of injustice, not anger, but the cry of a man who had just lost a part of himself he thought he understood. Footsteps of a correctional officer passed in the hallway. A middle-aged man, long silent in this line of work, caught a strange light in Vance's eyes through the door slot. He paused, then asked gently, as if not wanting to press too hard, "You all right?" Vance didn't answer right away. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to leave nothing behind. But then, as if there was no reason left to hold anything back, he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room mic to pick up. "We thought she was just an arrogant black woman, dressed like she had something to hide. We didn't think she was the system." No response came. The guard moved on without a word. That sentence wasn't said to justify anything. It didn't carry the tone of apology, nor did it sound like self-defense. It was more like a monologue, spilled from the cracked core of awareness when all the outer shells had finally shattered. Ryan Vance didn't cry because he got caught. He cried because he was forced to see something he had always dismissed, that calm gaze from a woman he thought was weak, was stronger than the system he believed he represented. And now, with the mask of authority ripped off in front of the entire nation, Vance was left with nothing but emptiness, and a question bouncing back at him. Why did you look at someone like her and see only a shadow to control? The cell light was cold and sterile, but inside Ryan Vance, something entirely new emerged. Not fear of judgment, but fear of facing himself. And from that moment on, he began to understand. The price of arrogance isn't the loss of freedom, being the truth too late to fix who you've become. When the Federal Detention Monitoring Unit submitted a report on Vance's post-hearing behavior, they didn't expect a single sentence from him to spark a debate bigger than the case itself. On page 4 of the transcript marked Internal Recording, Non-Emergency, one line stood out. "We thought she was just an arrogant black woman." One sentence, 6 words. Yet it reflected a whole cultural mirror, seeing people through appearance, not character. That line reached the desk of a veteran behavioral analyst at the FBI. Someone who had spent nearly 30 years in the field, investigating serial killers and spies disguised as model citizens. When he read it, he didn't write a report. He pulled out a red pen, circled the line, and scribbled a note in the margin. This is the question we must reverse. Did the system teach him to think that way, or did he choose to keep believing it? And the question quickly spread beyond the agency. An editor at a major opinion journal saw the quote from a leaked Oversight Committee document. A political commentator read it live on television, quoting it verbatim. Within 24 hours, dozens of articles appeared online with headlines like "Vance, product of the system, or willful deviant, prejudice, trained, or chosen." Ryan Vance wasn't uneducated. He held a university degree, graduated top of his class from officer training. He had taught rapid response tactics and instructed others on lawful engagement procedures. But in that moment, standing before Christina Hayes, he didn't see a civilian or a business leader or a government expert. He saw a black woman too confident, and from that, he switched to control mode. No evidence needed, no verification, just a feeling that someone didn't belong. So where did he learn that? Maybe from lessons not written in any manual, but passed in hallway chats, in coffee break jokes between shifts. Maybe from the way former colleagues used to say, "Check black folks more. If you're wrong, they won't know how to sue anyway." Or from performance charts that rewarded number of stops without anyone asking, stops of who? Or maybe Vance, through years of ignoring small contradictions, had reprogrammed himself so that every act of bias could be reasonably explained, every wrong contextualized, and eventually he could no longer tell what came from the system and what came from his own conscience. That afternoon, in her 10th floor FBI office, Christina Hayes received the transcript excerpt from the detention report. She read it in silence. Then, closing the file, she opened her personal notebook and wrote in soft, slanted blue ink, "The most dangerous system is one that convinces its enforcers they've done nothing wrong." She didn't write more because she knew the rest wasn't for her to write. It was for the country to confront. Not for Ryan Vance, but for every uniformed officer standing between two forces, procedure and humanity. And when that question is no longer avoided, maybe that's the day the system truly begins to change. Thursday, 7:18 a.m. The New York sky had yet to shake off the thin mist of a late spring chill. Christina Hayes arrived at the office earlier than usual, partly because of an emergency meeting with the Department of Justice, and partly because the unease she had been feeling was no longer just a vague sense. Her daughter, Alana, was still at home, under the watch of a former special agent who once served on a presidential protection task force. Since the hearing, the security surrounding her family had been heightened, though she had never admitted to feeling concerned. But this morning, concern knocked on her door, with a sign too clear to ignore. Her personal assistant, Amy, knocked 3 times before entering, holding a white envelope. No stamp, no return address, just a handwritten line. "To be delivered by hand to Ms. Hayes, urgent." Christina took the envelope. Her expression didn't change as she opened it, but her fingers tightened slightly when she saw what was inside. 1 A4 sheet, neatly typed in Times New Roman 12. No spelling errors, no extra words, no direct threats, but every word cut cold like steel. "You're not the only one who knows how to use the system for punishment. But remember, no one dares wound the goddess of justice unless they know exactly where she lays down her sword. You'd be wise to keep the girl away from the 3rd-floor window." Just below that, a bold, clear line. "Power doesn't save anyone once it slips from control." Christina read it once. No reaction, no immediate orders, but her eyes hardened. The 3rd-floor window meant only one thing: Alana's bedroom. The only room in the house with a large window facing the street, where she liked to open the curtains in the morning to watch the maple tree outside. Within 10 minutes, the letter was sent to the FBI's Materials Analysis Unit. A special response team was quietly mobilized. No sirens, no public alert. Just 3 people in black suits arriving at the building across from her home under the pretense of checking telecom signals. 2 hours later, a report landed on Christina's desk. An unfamiliar camera had been installed on the 5th-floor balcony of a short-term rental apartment across the street, aimed directly at Alana's room. The device activated at 9:47 p.m. the night before, just as Alana had turned off the lights. The alarming part wasn't the tech, it was the expertise behind it. The operator had left no traceable network activity. They had positioned the camera precisely in a blind spot of the FBI's surveillance system, and on the inside of the envelope, technicians found a faint fingerprint, not complete, but with 7 matching points. Enough for identification. Kyle Dermott. His name was pulled instantly. Kyle Dermott, male, 36 years old, former Level 2 security officer with the FBI's Internal Tactical Response Team, served under Christina Hayes for 3 years. No criminal record, no complaints, no disciplinary actions. He resigned 4 months ago, just 1 week after Christina signed the personnel reassignment order for internal oversight, which clearly stated Dermott does not meet psychological qualifications for protective duty. At the time, no one noticed. Dermott filed a resignation citing family pressure, need to care for an ill relative, a plausible excuse, nothing suspicious. But now, with his fingerprint on an envelope and his camera aimed at the FBI director's daughter's bedroom, this was far beyond the behavior of a disgruntled employee. Christina flipped through his file. Nothing stood out. No complaints, no prior threats. But it was the silence that made her grip her pen a little tighter, because she knew the most dangerous ones aren't those who are angry. They're the ones who understood the system and chose to dismantle it from the shadows. His name was Kyle Dermott, 36. The personnel photo showed a handsome man. Sharp eyes, square jaw, neatly trimmed hair. Graduated top of his class at the Federal Security Academy, specializing in tactical defense. His performance evaluations from the first 3 years were consistent, reliable, quick-thinking, highly adaptable under pressure. Christina had personally approved him for a Level 3 classified mission on the East Coast, a role reserved for those considered psychologically impermeable. During his 3 years under her command, Dermot had never been disciplined, never arrived late, never showed instability, but he wasn't warm, didn't share, left no signs of being driven by something greater than himself. He just worked, precise, silent, leaving no trace. Until after JFK, when the abuse of power investigation at the airport began, dozens of officers were suspended, and the internal response unit was, as one senior officer put it, shaken. Kyle Dermot abruptly resigned, citing family pressure, need to care for an ill relative. The request was approved quickly. No one questioned it, and Christina, in the chaos at the time, couldn't review every resignation in detail. But now, with traffic cameras showing him circling her home for 3 straight nights, with a rental account for the apartment across the street, linked to his secondary phone number once used for operations coordination, every puzzle piece now lit up a chilling truth. The threat didn't come from outside, it came from behind her. There was one detail in his old personnel file, seemingly insignificant, that now stood out like a discarded prophecy. In July last year, Dermot had applied for transfer to the high-profile protection team. His reason? I want to help safeguard the structure of the system from its most vulnerable points. It was a properly written request, logical, articulate, but after a closed psychological interview, he was removed from the candidate pool. The internal evaluation clearly stated, displays surface-level emotional control, but shows signs of high passive-reactive accumulation, not suited for high-pressure protective work. The final sign-off came from Christina Hayes herself. She had denied his application, and if anyone asked, she wouldn't deny it now. It was the right decision, professionally. But now, she faced a tougher question. How much does Dermot remember about the security system she helped build? How much internal knowledge does he still hold? Can he predict their next moves? And is he willing to cross legal lines for personal revenge? Christina didn't sound the alarm. She didn't alter her schedule, didn't release a statement, didn't show panic. But within 48 hours, her daughter Alana was relocated to a secure compound under a different name. No official emails were used. The new protection team came from an independent unit, personally selected by a senior aide. No links to anyone formerly in the tactical response team. Simultaneously, Christina sent a brief directive to the Bureau of Internal Security, encrypted and flagged for exceptional priority. Dermot is not a traditional criminal. He's a residue of the system, and because he once belonged to it, he is twice as dangerous. Priority: investigate all physical, technical, and personnel channels previously connected to him. Because Christina knew, when a system begins to collapse, the first stone isn't thrown from the outside, it comes from the hand of someone once entrusted to guard the gates. And Kyle Dermot, once the most skilled tactical technician, was no longer just an anonymous sender. He was a reminder. What isn't cleansed from within will eventually return, bearing the most familiar fate. At 1:12 a.m., the internal secure line rang in Christina Hayes' office. The blue backlight blinked 3 times, a verified code from Federal Detention Center No. 4, Brooklyn. The caller was identified as Ben Carter. There was no prior appointment, no request from his lawyer or the warden, just an unexpected call. In the middle of the night, when the city slept and everyone believed the battlefield had quieted. Christina looked at the screen for a few seconds, then pressed connect. She didn't ask why, no preamble, just a short, steady sentence. I'm listening. On the other end, Carter replied in a voice that didn't tremble but was hoarse, as if each word scraped its way out of a throat tightening in on itself. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness. I just need to talk to someone who doesn't think I'm a monster. Christina said nothing. A long silence followed. No echo. No background noise, just the void between 2 people who once stood on opposite ends of a war zone. Then Carter began to speak. Not in order, Not in the format of a formal defense, no lawyer overseeing, just raw, fragmented memories, blurred like an old photo, inside the mind of someone opening a door for the first time. My father was a cop, a good one, but he was never respected. He never beat anyone, never cursed, never faked a report. His team said he lacked the blood of a real cop. In 1996, he was dismissed, officially, for breaking protocol during a response, but everyone knew it was because he refused to use force on an unarmed black kid. I was 14. I heard the captain say to him, "If you're afraid to get your hands dirty, then you shouldn't wear the badge." Carter paused, heavy breathing, as if each sentence was being drained from an old, unstitched wound. I watched him jobless, disappointed, never able to hold his head up again. He went quiet, lived like he no longer had breath, and I swore on my own hands. I'd never let anyone take my power like they took his. Christina remained silent, her expression unchanged, but her hands had slipped from the keyboard without her noticing. Carter kept speaking, voice rougher, wearier, but truer. So I learned to speak louder than others. I learned not to back down. I chose to stay in control, always. I became the kind of officer they wanted, tough, relentless, above suspicion, but to do that, I had to erase a part of myself, the part that once cared, the part that once questioned. He chuckled, not a mocking laugh, but the laugh of someone seeing their own reflection and not recognizing who was looking back. Now I see. I couldn't escape my father's fate. I just switched roles. They said he was too soft. They said I was too harsh. But what they condemned was still not being enough like them. Christina stared at the screen, though Carter's face wasn't visible. Only the rasping breaths from the other end came through. For the first time, she felt that the name Ben Carter, in that fleeting moment, was not a verdict waiting to be issued, but a distorted legacy surviving across generations, across badges. A man who learned to wield power like armor to avoid reliving his father's wounds, only to become someone else's wound. The call was, but in Christina's mind, an old question returned, not for him, but for the system she was trying to fix. Where does injustice begin? With the hand that cuffs, or the silent lesson taught at age 14? And she knew, sometimes, a confession doesn't need tears, only the right moment, the right night, and the right person to listen. Christina didn't interrupt. She didn't interject to accuse, nor did she offer any forgiveness, but her gaze, in a room where no one could see, softened, not out of naive sympathy, but because in every broken sentence Carter let out, she saw something more dangerous than intent, the kind of prejudice born not from malice, but inherited wounds, passed down through blood, gestures, and silence between generations. Carter continued, without hesitation now, his voice lighter, no longer cracked like before, as if he was peeling away layers he had wrapped around himself through nearly 2 decades in the force. Each word wasn't a plea, but a confession to himself. When I saw you at the airport, I didn't see the FBI. I saw my mother, a white woman who once wore a white blouse to a parent-teacher meeting, only to be told by the teacher, "That's not appropriate attire for this neighborhood." I saw your eyes, the kind that resist something no one else in the room dares to name. I didn't see who you were. I saw my past. I saw the days my mom cried because my dad was called a soft cop, and then taught me never to let anyone find that soft spot again. You became the embodiment of what I was raised to defend against. Vance was always hot-tempered, always needed to assert power. But me, I chose silence. I thought silence was safe. I thought if I didn't speak up or act directly, I wasn't doing anything wrong. Christina leaned slightly toward the screen, still saying nothing. But inside, she sensed something she had learned to distinguish over 20 years. The difference between calculated deceit and truth that had simply arrived too late. But now I understand. Silence is also complicity. Looking away is no different than endorsing it. I was taught never to be weak like my father. That softness was career suicide. But in the end, the weakest part of me was not standing up for someone being wronged when I could have, when just speaking out would have changed everything. At that moment, the command center screen showed it was past 2:03 a.m. The call had lasted over 50 minutes, but time seemed irrelevant. Christina sat in the same position, no typing, no notes, just listening. Ben Carter inhaled deeply, gathering the last ounce of courage in his chest. I'm not asking for pardon, I'm not asking for leniency, but if one day your child asks, why was someone like me given a second chance? You can say, because he knew he was wrong, and he didn't go quiet like the generation before him. No more words. The line disconnected. The screen returned to its default encrypted interface, leaving behind only the muted glow of automatic lockdown protocols. Christina didn't save the call. She didn't order it flagged, didn't label the conversation as evidence or internal file. Instead, she opened a black leather notebook, the one she had reserved since the start of her term for things never meant for official records. Her handwriting was straight, unembellished, without punctuation or emotion, just one line. No one is born with prejudice, but everyone must choose how it ends. She closed the notebook, and in a fleeting moment within the sleepless city night, Christina Hayes, director of the FBI, no longer thought about sentencing, but about something harder to quantify: redemption. Not for the guilty, but for a society that had too long crossed its arms and called injustice procedure. 3 weeks after the initial hearing, just as the public began believing that justice was finding its voice and Christina Hayes was emerging as a symbol of transparency within law enforcement, an unexpected backlash surfaced. Not from the courts, not from police departments, but from major newspapers that had until then remained silent observers. 2 nationally circulated outlets, known for siding with institutional stability and defending the professionalism of law enforcement, simultaneously published articles in a tone deliberately ambiguous. Their headlines didn't directly attack, but subtly seeded doubt. Christina Hayes, a quest for justice, or a political move, and a carefully orchestrated campaign? The content emphasized Christina's failure to disclose her identity at the time of arrest, framing it as a possible, calculated setup designed to shock public opinion and elevate her influence within federal politics and internal agency circles. Some pro-polis columnists cited anonymous internal sources, claiming Christina had met privately with a documentary director prior to the incident. No concrete evidence was presented, but the insinuation was enough to suggest the body cam footage, viral images, and the FBI's swift reaction were all part of a pre-written script. On conservative forums, discussions began shifting. Those who had once shared the video in outrage now reversed course, asking, if she was really a victim, why didn't she say who she was? Or, why stay silent unless it was to build impact? Political commentary shows pounced on this as a moral gap, arguing that her failure to identify herself might create suspicion for countless others. They didn't reach conclusions, but they repeated one question that confused the public. Are we sure we're on the right side? Christina's office remained silent. No press releases, no retractions, no lawsuits. Her internal communications team launched no counter-campaign and didn't amend the case file. This silence only deepened public confusion. Accustomed to political pushback, many interpreted her quietness as defensiveness, or even an implicit admission. Inside the FBI, the pressure began to build. Veteran officers expressed concern about being dragged into political personalization. Younger agents, though privately supportive, grew hesitant as Christina's name appeared more frequently on television. Internal meetings were now fully sealed. No recordings allowed, even for archiving. Hashtags like Hayes staged it and power play began surfacing, small but dense with implication. Christina knew exactly what was happening. She was no stranger to media strategy. She understood how a pointed question, repeated often enough, could defeat even the most irrefutable truth. Yet she remained unchanged. No reaction, no defense, no retaliation. Not because she was weak, but because she believed that if truth could withstand scrutiny, it didn't need to shout. And if one day it were buried under rumors, the real loss wouldn't be hers. It would be the public's belief that justice could exist without a stage. While the major papers kept reshaping her image in suspicion, another article quietly appeared on the front page of Sentinel Independent, an investigative platform unaffiliated with government or advertisers. The headline wasn't sensational. It posed no violent hypothesis, just one line. "I don't know if Christina Hayes staged anything, but I know who's rewriting the story." It was written by Lena Morano, a veteran journalist who had previously exposed falsified crime statistics in New Jersey in 2021 and a scandal at the Washington Police Academy. Lena didn't claim to defend Christina. Her tone wasn't emotional. Instead, she began with facts. Several of the journalists attacking Christina had previously received funding or worked with Citadel Shield, a covert lobbying group for national police unions. Lena revealed leaked emails from Citadel Shield's internal media group outlining damage control strategies in response to the JFK fallout. One note read, "If we can't deny the evidence, weaken the symbol. Focus on personal motives. Seed doubt. Don't disprove, just make people unsure." She also uncovered that one of the two primary authors attacking Christina had been a communications advisor for the Port Authority Police in 2019 and had personal ties to an officer currently suspended in the post-JFK investigation. All this was published alongside verified documents, images, and citations. No opinion, just facts for readers to see. More notably, Lena acquired minutes from an emergency PR meeting among Eastern police defense groups. One line stood out: "If the Hayes case drags on, don't attack the law. Attack public perception. Turn her into an opportunist." The article didn't accuse, it didn't conclude. It closed with a sentence that was both cold and calm. "If you're right, why rewrite the storyteller before disproving the story?" Within 48 hours, the piece had over 3 million shares. Some journalists who previously criticized Christina quietly retracted their articles, citing lack of independent verification. On social media, Hayes' staged it faded, giving way to subtler, sharper line. Follow the money. Trace the funding. Ask who benefits. Ask who stands to gain. Lena never called Christina. She didn't ask for an interview or show up at FBI headquarters. She didn't need to. She did her job, to anchor the narrative when public opinion started drifting into smoke. Christina didn't respond, but that night she reopened her personal notebook to a half-written page. Below the line, "No one is born biased, but everyone must choose how to end it." She added a new sentence: "No punctuation, no emphasis. When truth is tested, the bravest one isn't the most powerful. It's the one who holds the pen steady." On the day of the final hearing at the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse, the sky was a dull gray, early winter winds cutting through the quiet crowd lining up outside. There were no loud chants, no protest signs, only a strange silence, the kind that descends on a society waiting to see whether justice can still hold its shape amid media noise and political doubt. Christina Hayes arrived on time. No escort, no press, no private attorney walking beside her. She carried a slim folder, wore a plain black coat, her hair neatly tied back, and her expression unchanged from the first time she entered the interrogation room at JFK, calm, precise, leaving no room for pity or spectacle. This time, she wasn't being questioned. She was no longer a victim. She was the key witness, the one who could draw the line between a personal failure and a system that knowingly continues to operate in error. Courtroom 4 was full. At the defense table sat Ryan Vance and Ben Carter. Carter looked at her, no longer avoiding, no longer hostile. His eyes seemed to say, "I've stepped out of my shadow. Now it's your turn to show what belongs in the light." Vance sat stiff, shoulders rigid, gaze hollow, not angry, not afraid, simply frozen, as if he had stopped trying to shape the outcome. When the prosecutor called Christina to the stand, the room went nearly silent. Her voice did not waver, did not rise, and did not seek sympathy. She spoke as if giving an internal report to a room full of analysts, not trying to persuade, only to be accurate. She outlined the timeline from the moment she was stopped at the security gate, separated from the passengers, subjected to threats, insults, and bribes. She explained why she withheld her identity, not out of pride, but to observe, collect data, and trigger the security protocols, exactly as she had taught countless young agents. Do not resist without cause. Do not strike without proof. What stunned the room wasn't the content. Most had been covered in the press or previous hearings, but her answer to the prosecutor's question, "Why didn't you say you were the FBI director from the start?" Christina didn't blink. "I wasn't there to stage a performance. I was there to see if this system truly believes what it prints on its badge." The silence that followed felt like the final stone dropped on a grave that had existed for years, just never engraved. But the prosecutor continued. After a brief exchange with his assistant, he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls an additional witness. He came forward voluntarily this morning and submitted a supplemental statement to the federal record." The judge raised an eyebrow. The room stirred. A defense attorney stood to object, but the judge motioned for silence. Christina turned. The back door opened. Footsteps echoed. A tall man in a senior police uniform entered, removed his cap and gloves, his face tight but resolute. Some in the courtroom leaned back. They recognized him instantly. "My name is Alan Richter, Deputy Chief, Port Authority Police Department. I'm here to testify for the prosecution." No one breathed. Christina looked at him, not surprised but clearly unaware beforehand. Her expression wasn't shock. It was a question. Not "why are you doing this?" but "why now?" Alan Richter stepped to the stand with a slow, deliberate pace, as though each footfall landed not just on the courtroom floor but on the very foundation of a system he had once defended. His face showed fatigue, but his eyes were steady. He swore in, confirmed his identity, rank, and years of service. His voice was hoarse, his words restrained, not out of fear, but because he knew every sentence could destroy a career and crack the long-held silence of his institution. "I'm not here to assign blame, not here to betray anyone. I'm here because I've been silent too long." The judge tapped the gavel once as whispers rose. Richter didn't look back, didn't respond to the stares of his former colleagues. "I received reports of racially biased misconduct at JFK, at least 3 complaints about black passengers being searched without probable cause. I read them, and I dismissed them. I said I would review, but I didn't. That was the first time I betrayed the badge I wore." No one interrupted. Christina sat upright, hands on the table, her gaze steady, not softened, not hard, just listening, as someone who once believed in the system listens when the system starts to speak. The rest of the truth. Richter faced the judge. "After Director Hayes' video went viral, I said nothing. I told myself, this will blow over, but I watched how my colleagues responded. I heard what they said in the halls, in break rooms, during briefings, that she brought it on herself, that she deserved it for acting above her station. No one cared whether it was true. They just wanted a reason not to change." He paused, inhaled deeply, and continued, voice firm now. "We're not afraid of truth. We're afraid of rewriting what we were proud of. But if this system has any hope of surviving, it cannot rely on loyalty to wrong. I can't wait for others to speak. This time, I choose not to stay silent." Silence stretched across the room. No movement, no applause, just a collective stillness. Because when someone like Richter stands up, no one can pretend it's just a personal grudge or media hype. He stepped down without looking back. He didn't glance at Christina, didn't wait for approval. But as he passed her table, she gave a small nod, not a bow, just enough to say, "I understand." That night in Christina's personal journal, she wrote only one line. "Holding office doesn't guarantee decency, but if those who hold it still have the courage to step out of the dark, then this system still has a chance." The third day of the final trial opened in the crisp chill of late autumn. Rare sunlight slid through the tall glass panels, casting patchy shadows on the marble floor of the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. Police officers stood scattered around the lobby, but there was no tension. Inside the courtroom, the air was suspended, as if everyone knew today there would be no more dramatic defenses, no sensational legal sparring. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen. Neither the prosecution nor the defense called additional witnesses. Defense attorneys simply requested the current record remain unchanged, with no lengthy closing arguments. After the unexpected and explosive testimony from Deputy Chief Alan Richter the day before, the conditional defense strategy of Vance and Carter had completely collapsed. No one in the room could invoke following protocol with a straight face anymore. Even the elderly court guard who had watched hundreds of trials admitted during recess to a colleague, "I've never seen a trial where neither side wants to argue anymore." The jury was dismissed to deliberate at 10:47 a.m., taking with them case files, notes, key testimonies, and video evidence. But everyone knew what remained was a formality. The evidence was too clear. The testimonies aligned. The misconduct was fully documented. No room for doubt remained. At 3:32 p.m., the jury returned. Less than 5 hours. Enough time to fulfill protocol, but it was clear the verdict had been unanimous from the beginning. When the clerk entered with the sealed envelope, some held their breath, but no one was surprised. They were about to hear what had already been silently accepted. The presiding judge, an older man with silver-white hair, known for his firm and principled approach, opened the envelope, glanced briefly, then raised his head to read the verdict. His voice was clear, measured, unembellished, but each word landed like nails driven into the floor of a courtroom where justice had long struggled for footing. Defendant Ryan Vance, guilty. Violation of federal civil rights under Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code. Conspiracy to extort under the Hobbs Act. Sentence, 12 years in federal prison. Guilty. Aiding and abetting civil rights violations. Obstruction of a federal investigation. Sentence, 8 years in federal prison. No one reacted. No one cried. No shouts of protest. Only the heavy silence of a truth that had finally found a place to exist. Ryan Vance closed his eyes. No words. No resistance. No eye contact. His body seemed to retreat inward, from a predator to a cold, silent shell accepting its fate. Carter was different. He stared straight ahead and nodded. Not in joy or regret, but like someone acknowledging, "I knew this, and I chose not to run." Christina Hayes sat quietly at the witness bench, hands resting on her lap, head slightly bowed. She didn't look at them, didn't show emotion, but when the sentencing ended, she gently folded her hands, like closing the final file of a report she'd spent her career preparing, not out of revenge, but to keep a system from decaying from the inside out. Behind her, journalists rushed to the hallway. Phones raised, microphones lit, cameras rolling. The news spread like wildfire. Vance sentenced to 12 years. Carter convicted of complicity. FBI director silent after verdict. Headlines appeared within minutes, but inside the courtroom silence held. No applause, no declarations, because everyone understood this verdict brought no catharsis. It didn't restore what had been lost, couldn't erase the harm, and wouldn't bring justice to those who had walked away from the system out of quiet despair. The verdict did one thing: it redrew the boundary between power and justice. However late, however costly, through sacrifice, trauma, and a silence stretched to its breaking point. When the gavel struck one last time, no one stood immediately. Movement slowed, as if waiting for someone to say something to close it all. But no one did, no need. And the only person who could didn't have to. Christina Hayes stood, still holding the single folder she'd brought that morning. Her face remained unchanged, not bowed in humility, not raised in triumph. She left the courtroom like a civil servant exiting a meeting. Without glory, without emotion, without a single quotable line. Reporters waited at the rear exit. They surged forward, not with outrage, but with the desperation of a news cycle hungry for sound bites. Director Hayes, just one question. Anything you want to say to the public? Do you think the verdict can restore trust? Questions shot like bullets, but she didn't stop. She didn't flinch or weave through. She simply walked straight ahead as if moving through a corridor at federal headquarters. A young reporter, likely covering her first major case, pushed to the front and nearly shouted, "Director Hayes, Don't you want to say something to the millions who supported you? Christina paused for exactly 1 second, long enough for cameras to flash, long enough for every microphone to lean forward. She didn't turn around, just shifted her shoulders slightly and said, "I don't need their support. I just need them to understand." Then she walked on, without another word. A black SUV waited at the end of the parking lot ramp. No sirens, no federal escort, no internal footage documenting her exit. The door shut quietly, closing not a chapter, but an entire era in federal justice. That evening, television stations replayed the moment. Her composed face, slow step, and a single cold, cutting reply. Some anchors called her too reserved. Some viewers commented they wished for more emotion, but most stayed silent, because they understood some truths are beyond words. Some wounds don't need to be voiced, and some victories don't require applause. Christina didn't return to FBI headquarters that day. She spent the afternoon in an unexpected place, the Office of Special Federal Oversight, where complaint intake protocols were under review. She didn't come as director. She sat quietly in the back row, listening to a young official present a new monitoring system proposal. Before leaving, she left a slip of paper on the secretary's desk. No name, no seal, just one sentence. Justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins with not forgetting. 3 days after leaving the federal court in Brooklyn, Christina Hayes returned to her office as FBI director in Washington, D.C. Unlike her predecessors, who typically spent an entire week preparing speeches after major trials, she held no press conference, gave no media interviews, and offered no personal reflections to any network. On political broadcasts, commentators asked, "What will Christina do after JFK?" She gave no answer. Instead, she acted. At 8:00 a.m. Monday, an urgent directive was sent through the encrypted internal system to all regional directors, heads of personnel inspection, the Bureau of Internal Security, and specialized technical teams. The subject line was concise, but the subheading made everyone stop what they were doing. Request for review and reassessment of all protocols concerning the intake, processing, and closure of complaints related to abuse of power, racial bias, and record manipulation. These reviews normally occurred every 18 months, mostly procedural, and only applied to units with statistical anomalies. This time, Christina appended one bold italicized line: "No unit is exempt from inspection, all included. No exceptions, no privileges, no safe zones." From major hubs like Boston, Denver, Los Angeles, to small satellite offices in Middle America, the entire FBI was placed under self-audit, initiated by a director who had no interest in preserving appearances. Christina didn't speak to the media. She gave no justification for the review, but everyone understood. After JFK, she wasn't just addressing an incident. She was cleaning the house she had lived in, climbed through, and once believed operated on principle. Now that she knew not everything was clean, she didn't speak. She picked up a broom. Within 10 days, 73 cases were ordered reopened, mostly complaints previously dismissed as lacking grounds or insufficient evidence. 34 investigations closed under suspicious circumstances in the past 5 years were reinstated, over half related to personnel responsible for public contact, detainment, or emergency airport protocol. Lists of staff who manipulated personnel systems were sent to every office for cross-referencing, tenure audits, and promotion reviews. In parallel, Christina submitted a formal proposal to the U.S. Department of Justice to create an independent interagency oversight task force under DOJ authority, but with access to FBI complaint and personnel systems. It was unprecedented. The FBI would no longer have sole authority over investigations into its senior figures in law enforcement quickly messaged her, some probing, others suggesting she slow down to avoid instability. A few resigned, citing health, career changes, or retirement. None admitted they were stepping back out of fear. A quiet resistance began to emerge. Subtle, but not yet open defiance. Not because they feared Christina, but because they understood. She wasn't a voice. She was a cycle. And if the cycle didn't complete, they would fall when the next wave hit, and no one would be left to shield them. In her office, Christina didn't call it reform. She didn't polish policy. She didn't post thank you messages on LinkedIn. She declined all interviews. She simply worked, like she was racing against something no one could see, an institutional rot that, if left untouched for a few more years, might become terminal. 1 week after the internal audit order, Christina sent a second wave of memos, this time to every major Port Authority police department in the country: New York, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, Dallas. Each had a history of civil rights complaints closed for lack of evidence. No press knew, no leaks, just encrypted federal memos containing behavioral analysis sent through verified interagency channels. Signed, Christina Hayes, Director. Contents: immediate formation of temporary, independent oversight units with full access to complaint records from the past 7 years, including cases handled internally or resolved administratively. Initial reactions at local departments ranged from shock to strategic concern. Legal advisors called DOJ. HR held internal briefings. Some reevaluated federal cooperation protocols. Others warned the move risked federal overreach into local disciplinary authority. Yet no one challenged the initiative publicly, because this time, the FBI wasn't investigating alone. Christina had called for horizontal oversight, inviting ACLU, Innocence Project, and independent academics to the table. Groups once dismissed as nuisances were now seated as official watchdogs. For the first time in decades, the FBI voluntarily shared power over itself. In a closed-door meeting in D.C. surrounded by oversight representatives, Christina didn't make appeals. She didn't call for unity. She simply said, "We don't have time to protect each other's reputations anymore." An airport security chief had once emailed her a friendly warning. "I get your push for transparency, but maybe keep some allies to prevent the organization from bleeding out." Christina replied with 9 words: "Allies aren't accomplices. If they are, stop." Her purge irritated many veterans. A group of mid-level agents submitted an internal memo citing loss of organizational identity, coded language, implying that revisiting past wrongs blurred moral lines. Christina didn't respond. She forwarded it to an ethics investigator previously fired from the CIA for cultural incompatibility, now brought in as her special advisor. When asked by close colleagues, "Are you afraid of alienating supporters?" she replied, "If they only supported me before I exposed them, then it wasn't support. It was waiting for my silence." Some called her a traitor, others avoided her. Yet during that time, a handwritten letter arrived from a retired FBI employee whose wife had once been wrongfully searched at an airport. "I didn't think anyone would ever have the courage to look inside this organization and say, 'No, we're not okay. Thank you for not closing your eyes when the lights finally came on.'" Christina read the letter, said nothing. She folded it and placed it in a private drawer for records not entered into any system. Under the soft glow of her office lamp at 1:00 a.m., she added one more line beneath her journal entry: "There is no reform if everyone stays comfortable." Then, without punctuation or emphasis, she wrote, "If discomfort is the price of a healthy system, I'll pay it." When the first email about a new training course titled Race and Power in Law Enforcement reached all FBI units and federal law enforcement agencies, no one paid much attention. Among the usual flood of routine updates, meeting invites, and internal newsletters, most assumed it was a standard diversity seminar, the kind where people sign in, nod through a few PowerPoint slides, and head out for coffee. But then their eyes stopped on the last line of the email, and suddenly no one thought this was just another seminar. Participation is mandatory. No exemptions, no substitutes. You will not be considered complete unless you pass the final assessment. The backlash came almost immediately. Police unions called the FBI director's office. Internal comms advisors suggested postponing the program to maintain internal stability. Conservative political podcasts called it justice-wrapped indoctrination. Christina Hayes didn't respond. No press releases, no televised debates, and no step backward. The program didn't take place in large auditoriums. There were no podiums, no slogans. Participants were assigned to small, mixed groups, no more than 12 people, shuffled randomly across ranks, regions, and roles. A tactical operations commander from Chicago could be seated next to a brand new admin hire. A seasoned inspector had to hear a story from an intern. Phones were banned, no uniforms allowed, name tags removed. In gray-eyed rooms stripped of titles, there were only people, and the biases they never had to name. The internal manual made the purpose clear. In the face of bias, everyone is a citizen. No position grants authority over right and wrong. Some walked out on the first day, others disengaged, silent, arms crossed, visibly annoyed. They called it too emotional, not grounded, or a subtle guilt trap. But no one was excused, and none could avoid the program's most uncomfortable section: unedited body cam footage. No music, no narration, no cuts. One clip lasted 7 minutes. A police officer standing over a handcuffed black man, unarmed, simply asking, "What did I do wrong?" The officer gave no answer, just repeated, "Sit still, don't move." The camera shook, not from tension, but because the officer's hands were shaking. Another clip showed a mother recounting the night her son was stopped outside their home for wearing a hoodie while jogging after 9 p.m. She didn't cry, but her voice slowed, as if language itself strained to carry the burden of explaining to a child why they were treated like a threat without cause. Participants were forbidden from speaking during the viewings. No commentary, no speculation. They were given a blank sheet of paper and told to write down what they felt. No grades, no evaluations, but the pages were collected and encrypted, used as a data set for emotional response analysis under cognitive stress. One officer anonymously wrote, "I used to think I wasn't biased, but then I saw that video and realized, when someone doesn't fear me, I see them as more suspicious. So have I been taught to fear people who don't fear authority?" A young female agent wrote, just one line, "For the first time, I didn't know what to wear to class because I didn't know how not to be misunderstood." The final exam wasn't a quiz. No multiple choice, no theory. Each person received a scenario. Simple, realistic, and deeply uncomfortable. You have the authority to ask someone to leave. They're unarmed. They've broken no law. But they don't look like anyone you usually see here. No one else is around, no cameras, you can let it go or exercise your authority. What do? Handwrite your answer, no edits, no reprints. Many hesitated, not because they didn't know what to say, but because it was the first time they were asked to be completely honest about an instinct and put it in writing. A rapid response team leader from Texas wrote, "I'd ask them a few questions, try to be polite, but if they were short with me, I'd ask them to leave, not because they did anything wrong, but because I wouldn't be able to read them. I wouldn't trust them to cooperate if things went bad." Below that, the class supervisor wrote, "Is your unease coming from them, or from the fact that you have no reason to use power, and that makes you feel powerless?" Some walked away from the sessions feeling resentful. They felt accused, judged, ethically interrogated by hypotheticals. But others, quieter, began replaying times they had done something similar. No one had objected then. No one had complained. But now, in that room, they were forced to face those moments for what they were, a mirror to a system that needed fixing. At a class in Denver, a senior white officer, 28 years on the force, stood up midsection, placed his exam on the desk, and walked out. 10 minutes later, he came back, sat down, and rewrote it from scratch. When asked why, he replied, "Because the first time I wrote to be done. The second time I wrote to see if I was lying to myself." Christina Hayes didn't attend any session in person, but she received every feedback report. No rankings, no personal scores. just statistics tracking how many participants realized they had once acted with implicit bias. After 6 months, that figure was 71%. In one internal briefing, someone asked her, "Director, if this course causes so much discomfort, even undermines people's confidence in themselves, should we make the content a little easier to absorb?" Christina didn't respond immediately. She took out an old case file and placed it on the table. The cover read, "Civilian complaint, dismissed for lack of clear evidence." Inside was a letter from a black woman who had been publicly frisked in front of her 8-year-old son at an airport for looking emotionally unstable. Christina closed the folder and said, "We've had plenty of training to help law enforcement feel respected, but we've never had one to help them understand what it's like to not be believed, to not be defended, the way they've treated others. The best lesson isn't knowledge, it's reversal." The room went quiet. No one asked again, because they knew this wasn't just a training program, it was a mirror, and for the first time, everyone was being asked to look into it and see themselves when power is turned upside down. On a misty winter morning in D.C., Christina Hayes stood alone at her mother's grave. The headstone was simple: Marjorie Hayes, 195219997, with a line below it carved by hand. She spoke, they punished. Her mother, a public health worker, had once reported a racist doctor who refused care to a black patient. No one defended her. She was transferred, then fired, labeled incompatible. She stayed silent, not out of defeat, but because she had a child to raise. Christina remembered that silence, the quiet at the dinner table, the unspoken sacrifices. That day at the cemetery, she placed her hand on the stone and whispered, "I wasn't silent like you had to be." No tears, no flowers, just a message carried back across time that her mother's voice had not been wasted. A week later, Christina returned to FBI headquarters. Inside, the building ran like clockwork. Scanners flashing, doors unlocking, guards nodding in silence. But something had changed. New recruits didn't just admire her, they regarded her with the careful respect reserved for someone who doesn't let things slide. In the elevator, a young employee stood beside her, fresh suit, coffee in hand. Nervous, he asked, "If they'd known who you were that day, do you think they would have acted differently?" It wasn't naive, just honest. Christina met his gaze, steady and composed. "I don't need them to treat me differently because I'm the director," she said. "I need them to treat me right, because I'm human." The doors opened. She walked out without another word. The young man stayed behind, holding his coffee, wondering if it was still warm, and knowing from that moment on he would never ask that question again. Not about anyone. Not to anyone. Have you ever been judged just for how you look, where you're from, or how you choose to express yourself? Have you ever stayed silent in the face of prejudice, only to realize that silence was your strongest move? If Christina Hayes' story made you think, share it, so more people can see that justice doesn't come from power. It comes from how we treat those we don't yet understand. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more bold, sharp, and inspiring stories like this one.